and welcome to today's webinar on approaches to ESG data for analytics. My name is Sarah Underwood. I'm an editor here at 18 Group, and I'll be moderating the webinar. Our expert speakers today are Roshni Johari, Head of ESG Analytics at HSBC, Nirav Shah, Head of ESG Analytics at M&G, and Boyka Babula, Strategic Solutions Director Americas at Alveo. Just a little bit of information to help you get the best out of the webinar. To the right of your screen, you'll see a Slido panel which covers both questions and polls. We'll be running 3 poll questions today, so do please take part in those so that we can see where you are on your ESG journey. And if you'd like to ask the speakers any questions, please feel free just to tap those into the question box at any time, because we'll be taking questions as we go along so that we could be sure we take as many as we can. So please just feel free to add those as and when. Okay, enough of me, and let me come back to our speakers. Roshni, please introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about your interest here.
Hello, my name is Roshni and I lead ESG analytics for Group in HSBC. My background is in AI and climate change, and I've worked across multiple sectors, finally ending up in finance for now. I'm really interested in general around the how we can combine climate tech and AI together to help make our capital flow towards a more planet positive outcome. ESG data is, although controversial in many ways and hard to sometimes understand, it's still one of the important tools that we have which help us assess the operational activities of organizations and how we can help them transition towards a more climate positive path. So that's really where my interest is, and that's current focus areas for me and my team.
Thank you very much indeed. Nirav, over to you.
Sure. Hi everyone, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Nirav, and I head up the ESG analytics team at M&G Investments. My work predominantly revolves at the cross-section of technology, sustainability, and innovation. So we use technology to machine ESG data and make it available to our investment managers to make investment decisions, and also offer oversight on our investments in terms of the ESG credential of those investments. Looking forward to speaking to you in more detail on this webinar today.
Fab. Thank you very much. And over to you, Boyka.
Hi, I'm Boyka Babula. I work at Alveo, a financial data management company. I'm responsible for designing and developing solutions on top of our core software. And one of the solutions and services that we have developed is an ESG data management platform. So I'm happy to share my experiences today.
Excellent. Thank you very much indeed. Let's get started with an audience poll. The question is, to what extent has your organization made progress on getting ESG data into shape for analytics? Okay, while you answer that question, which I'm sure won't take you very long, let me come to Roshni to set the scene and tell us how she sees progress in terms of what financial institutions have been doing in terms of getting on with ESG data and how well they're getting it into shape for analytics.
ESG data, just for background, stands for environmental, social, and governance. And you can think about them as these 3 pillars, and the data itself are data points that describe the features of these 3 pillars. You can think about environmental as understanding what the emissions are, is hazardous waste being produced. Similarly, social and governance focus more on how does a company treat its workers, and is there some sort of policy or regulation around to ensure that that's being done in a good way. So that's your ESG data. And we have loads of vendors who are going around collecting these data points, but each one comes from a different methodology, different taxonomy. And this has created a huge amount of data points with different constraints behind it, which makes it quite difficult for us to only use one. So I believe that a lot of the financial institutions have been looking at this over the past 2 years and coming up with a way on how we can create almost like a utility wherein you bring all of these data points together. So it's not just one vendor's opinion, because there is a lot of subjectivity here. We have to consider multiple vendors and multiple data points and then develop a more fair and just scoring method. There's also the problems around systemic geographical gaps, and a lot of the banks that I know of are starting to put in frameworks wherein we start creating opportunities for our clients to themselves report that to us. This helps us get a lot more data where vendors don't always reach. Especially coming from a very large global organization, this is imperative so as to make sure that our models are not biased and we create a very representative system. So yeah, I think, and it's not just FIs, we have a lot of policies and regulators who are working really hard to bring all of these things together. So with their help, as a combined effort, this has made a huge amount of progress.
Okay, thank you, Boyka. What would you say that when you're out and about and talking to customers and other firms, what sort of progress are you seeing?
Yeah, so one of the things is we recently did a survey among 300 buy-side firms, right, just to get some insights as well, what is happening in the industry, and what we found is that the top 3 challenges for using ESG data and also the priorities were data comparability, data availability, data usability, right? So if you look at from that perspective, then you start wondering, right, if you start doing analytics on top of the current state of data, how repeatable is that, right? How repeatable is that process to estimate the models and to start using the models themselves? So I'm curious to see what the outcome will be of the survey that we are doing right now.
Okay, Jerianne, please may we see the survey results? Okay, Roshni, what would you say to those results?
I think FIs need to talk more about what they're doing, and I feel like it's communication, marketing, informing, literacy as well in terms of data literacy. There's a lot of comms that need to be done to show what work is being happening in the background. But I do understand there's a lot of mistrust in the data just because of the discrepancies in how each vendor would portray what sustainability means.
Okay, that's great. So our audience is sitting a little bit in the middle there, and let's run another poll question to find out what their problems are. And the question is, what are the challenges of ESG data at your organization? This time you can tick as many of the boxes as are appropriate to your organization. And while you do that, let me bring in Nirav to talk about the challenges of multi-source high volume ESG data.
Sure, and just building on top of what Roshni and Boyke were talking about, just taking a massive step back. When you talk about ESG data, especially from an investment management firm like ourselves, you're talking about predominantly 4 sources of data that's directly coming from companies that you are investing in, which we classify as issuer disclosed data. So this is things like emissions, typically. Then there are qualitative data, so data that you're inferring from what these investee companies are talking about in their annual reports, in their earning calls and things like that, using AI and machine learning. And then the third category of data that we generally deal with is a derived metric that you create internally in the organization. So typically, building on the emission example, you try and build up intensity, which has a denominator that you have chosen per AUM, per revenue, or per square kilometer, square foot. And the final category of data that we deal with generally is vendor produced data, which Roshni delved into a little bit. So typically every investment management company is dealing with 2 to 3 at the least, if not more, different vendors sourcing ESG data from all of these 4 sources. So for an analytics and a technology team like ourselves, we are dealing with a wide sources of data coming into it and trying to make sense of it. And generally, when you try and do this, the typical problems that you encounter, number one that we see is that of comparability. So a typical example would be how you calculate intensity versus how someone else has calculated intensity, because what denominator have you chosen? How has the issuer disclosed the credentials that they are disclosing? So we still need to have conversations and standardization on things like that in terms of how are these metrics calculated. So going into a bit more detail on those. The second type of problem that we normally encounter is, and again, these problems are not new. They've suddenly become amplified because the volume of ESG data is increasing. The scope ESG data that we're taking into account is increasing, and also its importance is increasing. So when you are typically dealing with vendor-produced data, which is things like ESG rankings and scores, etc., there's this issue of transparency. There's a very interesting piece of research. It's probably my best ESG literature to read if anyone's interested. It's produced by MIT, and it's very aptly called Aggregate Confusion. Look it up on Google. And what they've done is they've reached out to all the different ESG vendors and compared how their ESG rankings correlate to each other. And they've, unlike a typical metric like, say, credit ratings, the ESG ratings are very divergent, is what the kind of solution is. So how do you make sense of all of that? And the conclusion to that, if not to trivialize it, but it lies in that ESG is a very qualitative analysis. It's not, there is in that diversity and in that difference that the vendors have lies the true richness of it. So essentially what you do is you bring all of that data in-house and offer it a human overlay to offer a further qualitative analysis on top of it to understand it. But at the same time, what we also need in the industry is a bit more of transparency on the vendor side on how are these ratings being produced, not necessarily standardization, because the diversification is really good, but transparency on methodologies and frameworks. So these are key problems that come to mind with ESG.
Okay, Roshni, what would you add there, particularly in terms of the volumes of data? As Nira said, the volumes are rising. The similarity is not rising. How do you manage these huge volumes?
I think from a volume perspective, ESG is still not that big a problem as much as the representation of where the volume is coming from. So a challenge that you wouldn't always think of is machine learning, which is a type of AI, would generally want to build models through patterns. But if all of the patterns are only coming from certain geographies, that model becomes inherently biased. And I think for us, as we come to climate tech and we use machine learning to build our predictions and forecasts, it's really important that we build that sort of representative data, which then leads us to the world of estimations and inferences, which can become quite difficult from a finance, audit, and regulatory perspective. So for me, like, those are some of the big challenges where we think about how do we fill in the gaps. Also from a reporting perspective, a lot of the ESG reporting happens on an annual basis, but the emissions that we see are generally at a 1 or 1.5 year lag. So we use a lot of satellite data to help us then come up with more real-time emissions. And from that perspective, we're trying to increase our volume and geographical representation. But yeah, that would be the challenges for me from an AI perspective.
Okay, that's great. Thank you very much indeed. And please maybe see the poll results. And Nira, perhaps you'd like to comment on these. Yes, that doesn't come as a great surprise, does it, really?
No, so this is exactly what I would expect the community to come back with. Sourcing accurate and complete data definitely remains the biggest problem because there isn't nearly as much coverage as required, and unfortunately the way the regulatory regulations are headed, the investment managers and the pension funds are required to disclose. However, the underlying data just isn't there. So I think more work needs to be done to getting that source data more rich and vibrant. And then integrating the data and achieving the data quality. Again, a lot of companies, and we can talk through that a little in our subsequent questions, a lot of companies are struggling with that also because of the pressure of the regulation that's out there right now. But the advice, and most of the companies are achieving this by doing top-down analysis through spreadsheets, etc., which is leading to further operational issues that we'll talk through in a bit. But no, that definitely doesn't surprise. So the top three are definitely what we expected to come through.
Okay, thank you. So we're all on the same page. That's great. Fantastic. And indeed, coming back to you, if I may, Roshni, and sort of focusing a little bit on regulation, how can FIs resolve some of these challenges and capture the required data sets and achieve compliance with emerging regulations? Obviously, we have things like FDR and the EU taxonomy, but more regulation is on its way from different jurisdictions. And it's okay having the data, but you've got to get it in the right place at the right time. How's that going to happen?
That is a complicated, still and debated open question, but some of the things that can be done from a very data-driven, scalable approach is how we like to look at everything in ESG at the moment, is to start thinking about more local and then rolling that up to global. And the reason I say that is local regulations can be quite different to what you would need. So some of those examples is your NDC, so your contributions towards emissions, so developed versus developing nations. Developing nations require to have more leeway in there because they're not at the same stage, and some of them would need it just to survive. They have bigger problems from a GDP perspective. So taking those things into consideration, the regulations are quite different. And then we'd also start having carbon tax, which is going to be applied quite a lot with the EU taxonomy and regulations coming in place. So the calculations become quite different and localized, but we do need to think about it as a global solution. So it's really how do we design a scalable data-driven structure where you have the local regulations sort of codified, for the lack of a better word, in how you approach the data locally and then rolled up globally. I think that also requires us as FIs to push the regulators, the data vendors, for more transparency behind how they're giving us the data, because that's not always obvious. And sometimes we're just given a black box accepted answer.
Okay, thank you. Nirav, what would you add there in terms of getting everything together that you need for regulation in the ESG space?
Yeah, not too much sure what Roshni said. To me, in my head, it lies twofold. I think we need more kind of low-level issuer data, and certainly more regulations, not for the FIs, but things like CSDR or CSRD. I always confuse this one. Will help, where individual institutions and organizations will soon need to start disclosing their ESG credentials as well. And besides that, especially from an investment management perspective, what we are good at M&G is stewardship. And that is a critical element of ESG, as in working with the companies that you are investing in to get them to disclose their ESG credentials and to get them on a path to transition. So I think a combination of those two is the answer, but I think we're still far away from there being enough data to be able to create a view, a coherent view of the investments.
Okay, fine. Thank you very much indeed. And let's come back to Boyka, if I may, and tell us how ESG data can be mastered, integrated with existing data, and tracked. Integration was obviously one of the challenges that we saw on the poll results. We've talked about how difficult the data is, how lacking it is in transparency and the ability to compare the data. With all that going on, how do you master it?
Yep, let's do mastering and then integration and then tracking indeed. So I think at the core, you need to have a flexible and expandable, because things are changing, right? Data flow framework, especially that takes care of all these core functionalities that you need on the data, right? And I'll explain in a little bit more detail, right? So if you look at mastering, it's really about acquiring data and storing that data. But acquiring data these days, right, it's from data vendors, it's from online sources. I heard satellite data, right? It can be anything, right? So you need to have all these building blocks that can acquire that data and then format it so that it can be stored, right? Or structured a little bit. But it's also different types of data. So your data model needs to be flexible, that you can store all this information. And Nirav already mentioned it, right? Data is not easily comparable. So you need to normalize it. That's another step. And once it's normalized, of course, you have all these different sources talking, let's say, about the same entity. So you need to start linking information. And this can be all kinds of information, right? Satellite data, fundamentals, ESG, it can be anything, right? And of course, you could have, let's say that you're using multiple sources to aggregate the data in a more complete copy, let's say. So that aggregation needs to happen as well. And of course, we talked about data quality, right? Right. So it's applying rules to check the data, workflows to ensure that you cover all the exceptions. You can have estimation of data to fill in gaps and so on. And of course, and that's for later on, but a lot of people are not thinking about it, it's monitoring and reporting. And monitoring in this case could be right? Where do you have duplication of data, right? Which vendors are supplying less data quality, let's say, right? And this is beneficial for later, right? When you start doing cost optimization and so on. But still, these things are good to think of, right? And you talked about integrating with existing data, right? If you do this data quality, let's say the data flow framework, right? If you have this whole data flow done correctly, that will happen automatically, right? Because part of it will be that linking of information. And it doesn't really matter if you set it up correctly, it doesn't really matter what type of data is going through this data flow, right? So that will happen automatically. And the same thing with how data is tracked. That's part of that exception handling, right? If you have all these rules triggering, they can create, let's say, watch lists and so on, or dashboards, right? So it will all come automatically if you think your requirements or needs through from the start, I think.
Okay, that's great. Nirav, as a practitioner, how are you approaching this in terms of the mastering and the integration and getting everything in place?
Yeah, sure. So not repeating what Boyke said, but to just reiterating that it's absolutely necessary to have a very sound technology infrastructure at the heart of your ESG data. And Boyke covered a lot of those aspects. So definitely have a good data warehouse and invest in some good tech before you do that. What we're seeing in the community though, and we've been through this journey, at least at M&G, for the last 3-4 years, and when I speak to other practitioners as well, is this whole reinvention of sort of processes in terms of ESG. So a lot of this analysis is being approached top down, and when it comes to reporting it out, you then start struggling with operational issues like, oh, who's going to offer the oversight on this data? Or who's going to sign off these numbers? Who's going to make sure this is correct, auditable, and there's no reputational or regulatory risk to this? So to me, therein lies a very big problem that the community is missing. I think we need to stop thinking of this as a top down and doing it from scratch and reinventing the wheel when it comes to ESG. Just like any of your financially reported information and any kind of financial metrics that you're reporting, it needs to be built in the heart of that. And when you start doing that, automatically all your organizational processes will lend to the oversight and the monitoring that Boyke was talking about to your ESG metrics as well. So suddenly then you're not struggling when you have to produce your TCFD report at the end of March, chasing someone in finance to sign it off and them asking you a lot of questions. So it's really important that we inherit all the processes that the organizations have already got, rather than thinking of ESG as something completely different. Because in my head, as we kind of mature on this journey, the regulatory and the reputational implications of getting this wrong are going to be as critical as getting any of your financial metrics wrong. So yeah.
So this is a very strategic journey, not a tactical journey. Yeah. Okay, Boyke, coming back to you, we've talked a little bit, or we mentioned metrics a number of times, and we know there are no sort of fixed metrics yet, obviously, but what metrics and processes can be implemented to ensure high quality ESG data that can be used for meaningful analysis? And is this a kind of a firm by firm thing, or is there something better than that?
Yeah, so I won't talk about the mastering that we just discussed, right? Because there you have exception handling, workflows, KPIs, watch lists, dashboards, and all of that. Because we're talking about analytics, what I, personally would like to see, right, more is some kind of data quality indicator on data, right? Because we have completeness, consistency, accuracy, timeliness issues, right? And if you're doing analytics, and if I was creating a model, I want to trust my data that I'm estimating the models on, right? So and of course, if you're doing the data mastering, you have a lot of insight on how complete is that data, right? What is the accuracy of the data? So a quality indicator can help downstream processes, let's say model development and using analytics, right? Even to somehow give an indication of the quality of the data itself, but also the results that's coming out of analytics.
Okay, Roshni, what would you add there in terms of metrics and so on for these kinds of things? There are no fixed terms and conditions, as it were, yet. So how would you look at that as a practitioner?
So very similar to what Boyke mentioned. So it's leveraging the use of DevOps, so basically creating more automated pipelines, ensuring that your data is ingested at a regular interval, raising alerts if that's not happening, then the follow-up tasks, such as it could be just the report itself shouldn't really be initiated until we are sure that the data has come in is healthy. So we have a data health checker per se. So all of our data, we call it data assets, which is just your table of data, but every data asset goes through a health check. And if it's, if it has a green tick mark, then it moves on towards its further reporting analysis. And for the same reasons, we can't build models over data that is not reliable. The other thing that I would mention from a processes perspective is to actually think about understanding your distribution of each of those data sets. So where is the data coming from? Which geographies is it representing? Because with ESG, that is quite important. Even from a governance perspective and a social perspective, it's not just about women's rights or humans' rights. There's a lot of other things. So if we only cherry pick a few data points, are we being representative of what ESG really stands for? And again, that's a business decision, but it's something to be aware of. And it should be a conscious decision, not just a decision because of data quality.
Okay, that's interesting. Thank you very much indeed. Let's run our final audience poll, if we may now. The question is, what types of technologies does your organization use for data discovery, mastering, and quality? Again, you can tick as many of the boxes as you feel are appropriate. And while you do that, let me come back to Nirav to talk about the types of technologies, tools, solutions, services that are useful here for discovery and transparency and quality assurance.
Sure. We spoke about the need for data warehouse and a sound data infrastructure. So we'll not go into that, but that's absolutely the foundation of a good ESG book of records of sort. Having a data warehouse that allows you the auditability and kind of quality management of that data. But besides that, what we struggle generally with ESG data is the problem of coverage, and which is where interestingly technology can help. So since not a lot of issuers are still disclosing as much ESG data as you'd like them to, what organizations like ourselves would then do is use some kind of AI or machine learning to get data out of the materials that they are disclosing in terms of their annual reports and earning calls and things like that. So using AI and machine learning and natural language processing to do that has been quite useful. Besides that, there are several other kind of ways technology can be powerful over here. We do a lot of kind of calibration and streamlining of vendor data to understand if there is any outliers or if we need to investigate any of rankings that they've got wrong, and also use a bit of kind of advanced analytics to understand. One of my favorite use cases has been a lot of the organizations have been disclosing their net zero targets, and it's a bit of a green finance gaming happening out there. So how can you use technology to link back these targets to what they're producing in terms of emissions and ESG credentials right now, and then extrapolate that information to see if they're ever going to reach say net zero by 2030 or 2050 or whatever they're claiming it to be, and then using that data to actively do stewardship is also critical. So those are a few interesting, besides the foundational technologies that you need.
Okay, thank you. Boyka, services, solutions, what do you see out there and what can you provide?
Yeah, I think Nirav mentioned some good points, right? So data warehouse, I would say, let's say, I call it an ESG data management platform that's critical, right? And he also talked about not reinventing the wheel in a previous question. So I think that is very important to start with that, right? And there's different options for achieving that, right? So you have data as a service being provided, managed services, and even using the services of an asset services. It could be an on-prem solution, or it could be even in-house development, right? Luckily, right, in our survey that we did, data as a service was on top, right? Managed services second. So you indeed don't want to reinvent the wheel, right? Only 13% said in-house development. So that data management platform, right, or the ESG data management platform, I think it's critical. But what we see a lot is right, that special service providers are being used for, getting data from all these online sources, right? And they're utilizing a lot of AI and ML to do that, right? To get that unstructured data in a more structured format so that it can be used in the models and so on.
Okay, that's great. Thank you very much indeed. Please move to see the results of this poll, see what our audience is using. Okay, lots of people got stuff up there in the cloud. Boyka, what would you say to that?
Yeah, I would fully agree with that indeed. So, for example, ourselves, we have moved to the cloud as well because everyone is asking for that, right? Everyone is moving to it. So, indeed, this makes sense.
Okay, that's great. Thank you very much for voting there. And let's take a quick break for some audience questions. We have quite a lot, so we'll answer as many as we can. Let me come to you first, Nirav, as a practitioner. The question is, what are the most important factors you and your team consider when deciding on which third-party data and analytics providers to leverage?
That's really interesting. So I think the answer that jumps to mind immediately is definitely we're very interested in coverage. So if the first thing that I would kind of check is what asset classes, what issuer universe, what indexes does the vendor cover, and how rich is it? And then besides that, in the kind of alternate space, what kind of alternative ESG data they could provide before starting a relationship. And then what is becoming really key now for us to be using this data, we really need to get to the detail of the frameworks and the methodology that they're using, because we incur that reputational risk on their behalf by using their data. So having the transparency of how a certain ESG ranking, if you're talking about ESG ranking, for example, was derived, and similarly, wherever they're using proxies and wherever they're using non-disclosed data and inferring data, how is that happening, and kind of making sure that is in line with our principles as an investment organization, and we can kind of use that. Besides this, as a technologist, I would always check if they've got sound technology infrastructure to be able to connect to us via feeds, via cloud. Most of the community mentioned cloud on the previous question. So yeah, those are my top few.
Okay, Roshni, would you add to that in terms of what you're looking for amongst vendors?
Yeah, I think Nero covered everything comprehensively. What we do to make it easier is we almost have a vendor assessment tool. So it's very similar to how we derive the health check. We definitely try to make sure that, so a lot of the times you get marketing in terms of we cover X amount of companies and we have these many data points, but nobody really tells you that for a company, how many of those data points are actually being covered. So it is really to hold the vendors accountable for what they're providing us and what we're paying them. And they should really be filling out our vendor assessment tool. So we basically ask them geography coverage, sector coverage for organizations, percentage coverage, percentage nulls and missing values. So for us, it's just like an initial assessment health check, and that sort of helps speed up the process, because then you can look for data more intentionally.
Okay, fine. Coming to you, Boyka, we have this question. It says, what does the panel think about outsourcing ESG data sourcing for analytics? Could this work?
And the answer for me is yes, that could work indeed. And of course, and I think, and it comes back to the question, right? And Nirav mentioned that it's not reinventing the wheel, right? Because if you think about what needs to be done, it's very complex. You think about getting data is easy, right? But if you want to monitor, like Roshni is saying, the quality of your sources, right? If you want to have transparency over where data came from, if you want to have all the controls on top of that, you don't want to build everything yourself, right? You rather have a service, right? That's data as a service, or you buy a data management platform.
Okay, that's lovely. Coming back to you, Nirav, I'm not sure how you answered this one quite, but it says, please would the panel suggest which metrics are best to prepare ESG data for analytics? We've talked about metrics around quality, but what metrics to make sure the data is useful for analytics?
Oh gosh, I can possibly not do justice to that. But starting with, so I think what you need to think about rather than giving you a list of metrics is ESG is very qualitative, as I started out with, right? And when you start delving into deep depth of ESG, you start thinking about materiality. The concept of materiality, essentially, which metric is a risk to a company's business operating model and what sector do they belong to. So when you start thinking about ESG metrics, you need to start thinking about the sector specific materiality. And now the industry is very rapidly moving towards this concept of dual materiality, as in, is a metric ESG risk as well as a financial risk or not. So those are a few things that you want to start thinking about. Start with the core metrics, which are globally and universally relevant to every company in the world. Every company needs to reduce emissions and kind of abide by the net zero targets that their nations have set out to be, and then kind of move on to more specialized ones, which are sector specific and derive them from what sector does the company belong to. A very good kind of beginners list for anyone wanting to delve into it is what SFDR is recommending. So read up on what metrics are in there. That's a pretty good list of metrics that we're required to produce. But that is how I would think about that question.
Okay, great.
Not a direct answer, but
no, I think at this time everybody's slightly different, aren't they? Because as you say, everybody has a slightly different approach. Roshni, coming back to you, and this may be a little bit too forward thinking. This one says, ESG investing is becoming a competitive market. How can we use data and analytics to our advantage? Are we there yet, do you think, or is this too early? Are you actually managing to do any of those things?
I think it's basically not just, I would say the trick is not just to use ESG and to enrich that with other information. So even when TCFD released their first guidelines, it was not just about ESG data, it's also their financial data. How resilient does the company look like? How much does it extend from a supply chain perspective? Because then there is a ripple effect of other things that might take place. So the pandemic was a great example wherein you had a supply chain impact, and I'm sure everyone felt it for something or the other that they purchased. So it's a combination of things. I would say that just relying on ESG on its own is only prudent if you have good enough coverage for your business. So what is relevant to your business, identifying that population, and then making sure that you have a representative amount of data to make that sort of decision behind it. If not, then I would, like any other machine learning scientist, would go and find other data points to help enrich my decision making.
Okay, that's great. Thank you. This one's about metrics too, and I'm going to put this one to you, Baiko. It says the ESG metrics is being very concentrated in the financing structuring phase, which seems too late to me. So my question is whether the structure of standards and taxonomy shouldn't be being directed towards the universal language of qualitative analysis concepts to then be properly measured. I think this is aiming at some sort of standards for analysis. What do you think?
Sorry, who were you asking to?
To you.
Oh, okay.
sorry.
I think this question is better for one of the persons at the financial institutions.
Okay. What do you think, perhaps, Nirav, if you're good on this? That seems too late, these ESG metrics. The question says, would it not be better to direct towards a universal language of qualitative analysis concepts that can then properly be measured?
Yes and no, and I covered that a bit in my previous answer. So yes, there are a certain set of global metrics that should be relevant to all the organizations that you're considering, things like emissions, things like injury rates, waste management, etc. But we cannot absolutely miss out the sector-specific materiality or the materiality of a certain ESG metric to the business model of a company. So no, there isn't in my head a completely yes answer to that. Into that standardization, we will always have to think through what risk is material to what company's operating model, and hence judge them on that risk rather than judging them on a risk that's not relevant to the industry they're operating in.
Okay, thank you. One last question, and this is open to all of you if you have any ideas, and it asks, what are the learning materials for a career in ESG? Where can people find more knowledge? Are there organizations, associations, that sort of thing where you can find knowledge? Events like ours, obviously. Any ideas?
I can definitely recommend, so definitely webinars like yourself for sure, but also there's a lot of there's different courses as well where you learn about ESG, but not just ESG on its own. You learn about the process to reach net zero. You learn about the taxonomies around it and the policies around it. So one of the ones that I did myself 2 years ago, which I really enjoy, and now I correct papers for, is with CISL, so the Cambridge Institute for Sustainable Leadership and Leadership. They have 3 courses which I think are really good to learn very much about net zero, ESG, overall sustainable finance, and it gives you a very comprehensive understanding.
Okay, that's great. Thank you all for your questions. And thank you indeed to our speakers for their answers. And back to my questions, and coming back to you, Boyka. How can FIs contain the cost of ESG data and analytics and therefore ESG investment?
Yep. So personally, I believe, it's a little bit early, right? Because we're still trying to solve data issues, and that's difficult to, because you want more data, right? Because you want to achieve higher quality of data. So personally, I think that's a little bit too early, but for the future, right? And we talked about it, and Roshni mentioned about those vendor scorecards, right? About assessing the quality, overlap between certain vendors and duplication and so on. So that's at some point that will happen, right? And we need to be prepared for that, right? If you have a system, you need to start collecting that information in order to be able to do that. But the thing is, if you look at cost, one of the biggest things that will reduce costs significantly is just having things thought out, right? What the needs are and what you need to do in order to fulfill those needs, right? And we talked about an ESG data management platform. It could be data as a service. It doesn't really matter. But if you start looking at your future requirements, certain things will become very difficult to do if you don't plan for it now, right? And you don't need to do everything now, but you have to your short-term needs, but long-term needs, but start thinking of those long-term needs, because it will require a lot of resources to do things later if you have not planned for it now.
Okay, coming back to you, Roshni, what would you say there in terms of trying to get things under control from a cost point of view?
Definitely data hygiene, as I've said multiple times, is top of the list because of all the reasons that Boyke mentioned. So I'm not going to repeat that, but it does help you establish a baseline. And then the next step would be to purchase for the gaps that you have determined because you have good data hygiene and you have a baseline now. So it helps you get more coverage. And then lastly, this is something that I personally believe in, is actually building a lot of in-house talent, because you can build a lot of models. There's a lot of data out there. There's a lot of data we purchase, and we don't really need 100 environmental risk scores. We just need a few, and we just need a model to help us determine which is a good one for the business. So I think having a good analytics strong team is actually quite helpful from a operational efficiency and to actually produce insights that are more relevant to you as a business.
Okay, that's great. Tell me something. How hard is it to source these analysts that you want?
I'm a really good data scientist. I have a data scientist assessment tool. If you haven't realized already, I have assessment tools for everything.
Yeah.
No, I think we have a really good graduate program as well. So we've been developing people for quite a while, and that helps grow people. And then having the right training programs in place to ensure that people are constantly learning and are excited about the problem that they're trying to solve.
Okay, thank you. And staying with you, Roshni, if we pull together everything we've talked about so far, can you just provide a step-by-step guide to sourcing and preparing ESG data for analytics so that anybody who's not done this before can get a clear idea of what to do?
So I would say step one is identifying what is your success metric. So what are you gathering this data for? So making sure you understand the business requirements. And the step two would be then to actually do some market research and understanding who are the vendors who are actually providing the data that covers maybe certain sectors. Is it for certain geographies? So you're more intentional in who you assess. Then it would be the actual assessment stage. And I would say then the next step is to actually do sort of like a proof of concept. A lot of the vendors are actually quite happy to do sample data sets for you to get a feel of the data, to help you understand the coverage. So if I have 10 clients and if the vendor has 100, I need to be sure that those 10 are covered in the 100. Otherwise, it's quite a pointless journey. So there's no point establishing a full end-to-end platform if we don't have the right data. So once you have a more successful proof of concept and the business is happy, the requirements being covered, then you basically set up a proper end-to-end scalable automated platform to make sure that you are following all of the steps that we've talked about earlier as well in terms of hygiene, testing, and quality.
Okay, thank you. Boyka, would you like to add something there?
Yeah, I would repeat that, and maybe in my own words, right? So we talk. I mentioned short and long-term needs, and I think Roshni mentioned that well as the business requirements, right? But then on top of that, right? So that's more or less, let's say, on a functional level, what needs to be done. Of course, that translates into data needs. But if you want to do analytics, there might be certain things in your data model that you want to do in a different way, like more using enumerations to easily get history out of the system and so on. Of course, and we talked about it, the right tooling and services, and I'm saying services as well because, right, there's a lot of expertise out there that you can utilize. You can do it yourself, but sometimes it's easy to get a service from a specialist. But what we didn't talk about is also to organize all these processes, right? So the data flows, but also the controls and so on. And at this moment, you start thinking a bit more ahead because at this moment, who's talking about transparency of this data, right? But in the future, if this is just as important as financial figures, right, you need to have the traceability of your results. And the last portion that I want to iterate is what Roshni mentioned before, is the continuous improvement, right? In order to do that, you need to have monitoring and reporting in place, right? And you need to start capturing a lot of operational information as well, right, in order to do that.
Okay, that's great. Thank you very much indeed. And Nirav, coming back to you, with all this going on, what are the benefits of getting ESG data for analytics right and the penalties for getting it wrong?
Yeah, sure. Quite good. So to me, in my head, two categories. One is external, and the other one is internal. So externally, there's definitely now regulatory and reputational risks that you're incurring by getting this wrong. Most of the companies will soon be obliged to comply by regulations, local or the geographies they're operating in, to be disclosing certain ESG credentials and being questioned on those. So definitely regulatory implications. Reputationally, as we see the industry moving, these green companies are going to attract more financing and more kind of value. So reputationally as well, it's a big leverage for you to get this right and kind of establish yourself as a sustainable business or a business transitioning to sustainability. And then to me, internally within the organization of getting this right, the number of stakeholders within the organization that are consuming ESG data now is rapidly increasing. So previously it would be just a ESG focused fund within a certain desk, but right now it's literally everyone from your board to your execs to your fund managers to your portfolio managers. So by getting it right and investing in the right infrastructure, you make sure it lends to your organization and you're not repeating those processes locally everywhere within the organization. And that, of course, leads to operational efficiencies. So those are some of the key kind of benefits and penalties of getting it right.
Okay, thank you. Roshni, what would you say there in terms of the benefits of getting it right and the penalties of getting it wrong?
I think Nirav has done like a really comprehensive discussion, which actually applies to me as well. I would just add that what personally motivates me, and I hope my team as well, is as part of a global bank with a very massive footprint, when we execute something like this correctly, it's going to have a huge positive impact. And this is an opportunity for a bank which you don't really associate with good. It's an opportunity for us to do something more positive and make sure that capital flows towards the nicer outcomes. And so I think for me, that's the driver behind it.
Okay, thank you very much indeed, both. And we're coming to our final question now. And I'd like to ask all our speakers to provide some advice for practitioners working with ESG data for analytics. Nirav, let me come back to you to start on this one.
Yeah, sure. And I'll try and be brief. So to me, the number one has to be don't reinvent the wheel. Build ESG bottom up into your existing infrastructure, into your existing processes, along with the rest of your financial metrics. Because soon later in your journey, you'll discover all kind of operational inefficiencies if you don't do that. And secondly, don't miss the human element of this. ESG is extremely qualitative, and you're not going to be able to automate everything. Adopt a model that's a combination of both. Outsource the parts that you can outsource, but then once all the machining of the data is done, don't forget the human element of it, which can help you deal with exceptions and quality management, and kind of offer that qualitative analysis of the analytics that you've got. Besides that, actively, and the third one I would say is actively think about technology in terms of areas where you're struggling with coverage, and what can you do to innovate to overcome that. There are some really good use cases now, very proven kind of models that Roshni was talking about, as well as NLP applications that can help you deal with those coverage issues. So those are my top three.
Thank you. Roshni, what would your advice be?
I think definitely I will double vote the focus on data technology, making sure that we are using things like big data, we're using machine learning to help us cover some of the gaps that we can't get to. So that is primary. Secondary, I think data literacy across your organization, so that in our case, a lot of the frontline managers, it's great if they know exactly what to consult with the client, how to help them move, transition. So as a financial institution, it's our responsibility as well to help our clients transition, rather than just saying, no, you're not sustainable, we're not going to finance you. The narrative should be, we want to finance you, let's find a way we can work together to make this from a more, a positive outcome. So that's the second one. And then lastly, it's actually constantly monitoring what's happening with the regulations and the taxes that are coming in, and to upgrading our systems as well for that.
Okay, that's great. Thank you. Coming to you for some last words here, Boyka.
Yeah, to be honest, most of the things are already said, but one thing that I want to add is, and this is more from a project management perspective, it's all about execution, right? And understanding your short-term and long-term needs, and then translating that into what needs to be done, and keeping in mind what you will need in the future. I think that is critical, because that's where a lot of resources will be lost I think for a lot of organizations, right? It's difficult to manage all. It is complex. One other thing that Roshni mentioned earlier, and I think I really like that, and especially for analytics, is the integration of all these different types of data, right? Because we are talking about ESG data, but if you combine all of that other data, it becomes very powerful, and you can start doing a lot of nice analytics on top of it. And
Okay.
you can get that competitive advantage that was asked in a question as well.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. Thank you all very much indeed for sharing your expertise and experience with us. Thank you too to Alveo for sponsoring today's webinar. Before we close, just a few 18 group webinars that may be of interest to you. If you scroll down your screen to additional options, you'll see webinars that you can sign up for. They are at the moment how to harness the power and potential of ownership data, meeting the challenges of regulatory change, and the challenges and potential of data marketplaces. That said, that's it for today. So thank you again to Roshni, Boyka and Nirav, and thank you to all of you who've taken part in the webinar. This is truly an exciting and, as Boyka just said, complex topic. So thank you very much indeed. Please complete our feedback form, as we're always keen to hear your views and improve our products. Meantime, thanks again and goodbye.